Kyle here from allmediareviews.blogspot.com, and here to do another what I'm now calling artist reviews. I'm going to do part 2 of Genesis, and probably be the last part, depending on how long this goes, hopefully. And I'm calling them artist review as opposed to random artist feature just because it sounds easier. It's almost like album review, artist review. So anyway, and I'll admit, I already tried making this video once and didn't come out like it should have. So I made one or two comments that I meant to not make. So anyway, so I left off after Peter Gabriel left in 70, I guess in effect it was 1975. 74, and they toured for the Lamb. I think that was into 75. Anyway, of course they auditioned, they tried to audition a bunch of singers and they couldn't find someone that really would work with him, and so Phil Collins, after all those other people auditioned, decided I'll give it a shot, and he was the best fit just by default. So they released Trick of the Tail, or is it A Trick of the Tail? I think it's A Trick of the Tail. So here's my copy of A Trick of the Tail. It's a gatefold. And I do like this album. In fact, it's one of my post Peter Gabriel my favorite post Peter Gabriel Genesis albums. But I don't prefer any of the albums after Gabriel left over this or any of them. I pretty much is more what I'm saying. There's the Gabriel stuff, and then there's everything else. So, but this album specifically, I really enjoy the artwork, the songs. I guess I would say among the highlights, Squonk, certainly, and Entangled. Those two. Dancing on a Volcano is nice. I mean, the opening 3 tracks really have a really good energy. Then I would also say Ripples. Ripples is one of my favorites. And I think part of the reason why I really love that song is because Annie Haslam of Renaissance sang a cover of it, and it kind of got me, like, I love her voice, and hearing her sing it, I got to appreciate and check out the Genesis version, and appreciate it more. Los Endos, of course, is like a Steve Hackett piece, and I also, with this album, I got the impression that that Steve Hackett's role was kind of, he came up a little bit more, because on the Lamb he was sort of in and out, and with Gabriel gone, they were a 4-piece, and so his role maybe was a little more prominent, at least in the writing, although that doesn't really hold water in terms of what would happen later with him. But the other thing I wanted to mention, I didn't mention when I originally made tried to make this video, is that this album and then the next album I always think of that story Wind in the Willows, because the artwork, like this guy right here on the front, the guy right there, I always think of, like, almost looks like he could have been one of the characters from that story, animated little short film or cartoon I saw in book as a kid. Anyway, but yeah, Trick of the Tail is a good record. It's very much progressive rock. It's just not as unique, I guess. The stuff after Gabriel left, they were doing, it's kind of what you'd expect. It wasn't unexpected, I guess, from a sound standpoint, but that doesn't detract from the quality of the music. So that was in 75, and then later in 75, I'm not going to pull up the exact release dates, I don't think, they released Wind and Wuthering. It's Wind and Willows. Wind in the Willows? Yeah, I know there's like a frog on that story, but I always thought Wind and Wuthering had something to do with Wind and Willows, and then I thought of the guy on Trick of the Tail right here with his balding. But anyway, this album, Wind and Wuthering, this particular copy I have right here is not a gatefold. There probably are some gatefolds that exist, but it's an Atco pressing. I'm not sure what. I'm not going to get into how new or old it is, but 11th Earl Mar, the first track on the first side, sounds a lot like a song from A Trick of the Tail, and that's one of my favorite songs. What are the other ones I guess I consider highlights? Blood on the Rooftops is kind of a sweet. Afterglow is kind of epic. It's a ballad. One for the Vine, it's a Banks piece, Tony Banks piece. And then Your Own Special Way, which is kind of a pop ballad. It's kind of a foreshadowing of what they would do on the albums that followed it a little bit, especially the album did follow it. And it's not a bad song. I was mentioning when I originally made this recording that the Roundtable podcast, Tabletop Genesis, have done reviews of most of the Genesis albums. They did this one, and they kind of didn't care for that song all that much, not universally. I think out of the 4 or 5 people in that podcast, I think maybe only 1 or 2 really liked that song. I don't mind Your Own Special Way. It's not great, but it's not bad. This album as a whole, though, almost sounds like soft rock I mean, it is kind of proggy at points, but it doesn't have any like real punchy, heavy riffs per se, other than maybe 11th Erlenmeyer. But you can even tell like the artwork sort of reflects that. I think A Trick of the Tail had a little more darkness, a little more edge to it. But then, I mean, it's a record that I like, but I don't hate it, and I prefer it probably from a lot of the other records they've released, a lot of the Phil records at least. But it just kind of sits there. It's one of those, I think a lot of people think of it as sort of second tier to Trick of the Tail. So then, Steve Hackett, of course, released a studio album, I think, right after Gabriel left the band, which I'm going to do a separate video, I think, for the Genesis members' other project solo, and I don't know if I'll be able to cover all the Gabriel stuff in there, but anyway, but this record, they released a live album the year after, that was in 77. It's like a double live album called Seconds Out, and this is the last album that Steve Hackett played with, was on any recording of Genesis. Of course, they had Chester Thompson take over on the drums, because Phil was the singer, at least in a lot of it. I don't know, he played some drums live, but yeah, the set list is good. This is a lot of people's favorite live albums from Genesis, and I don't know. I mean, I didn't show Genesis live and talk about it in the first video. I should have, but I'm not sure I ever ended up ever buying it on vinyl. But I like this album, especially this live album, from a set list standpoint. Squonk, Carpet Crawlers, Robbery, Assault and Battery, which is from Trick of the Tail, which is okay. Afterglow. The second side has Firth the Fifth. A lot of the Peter stuff. I Know What I Like. The Lamb Lies Down Broadway, the title track, and the musical box closing section, which I think was a common, like, closing section per se, live that they would do for a number of years. Although they call it the old medley, but they would add parts, I know, like from the cinema show, which is also on this. So like the second or third and fourth sides of the second, record, second disc, has Cinema Show, Dance on the Volcano, Los Endos, and then Supper's Ready. So it's got a lot of the classic Peter stuff and some of the better early Phil stuff. And it has both Bruford and Bill Bruford was hired after. This was in 76 or 77 when King Crimson, he had left Yes, of course, joined King Crimson for, I want to say at least Lark's Tongue and Red, or maybe it was just Red. And I got to go over that stuff before I do a Crimson video. But King Crimson in the mid to late 70s had gone on hiatus, so he was available. But he's not, I don't think he's on the whole thing. I think it's like half of it's him, half of it's Chester. So, but yeah, I mean, I guess Genesis Live from a kind of period-based kind of thing, and having Peter, of course, I still prefer, but a lot of people really prefer the Supper's Ready on this record, and they prefer a lot of the versions actually live. They prefer the versions live in general, or they just prefer those live versions versus live versions with Peter or other later live versions. So then, okay, so I need to backtrack. That wasn't technically, I mean, I'm not sure the order of the release. Technically, that wasn't the last thing Steve Hackett actually released. They did release this EP of sorts called Spot the Pigeon. And one of the pieces, Inside and Out, is a Steve Hackett piece, I believe. Match of the Day and Pigeons is the two other tracks on it. And I do like this version because it's a colored blue. And, I think I've listened to this maybe twice. And I heard them review it on the Tabletop Genesis podcast, which I would recommend any Genesis fan check out. Really in-depth analysis, not like these videos. But, yeah, this is sort of, it's kind of an afterthought. I mean, I guess I would probably still listen to this over some of the later Genesis stuff. But it's just 3 songs, and there were songs that maybe didn't manage to get on the album. So, I mean, Steve Hackett was on that song. I think the Match of the Day and Pigeons were maybe even written or at least recorded after he left, because they were from 78. He'd already left by 78, so. But, yeah, I mean, for the real hardcore collectors and fans, it's certainly something to think about. But, it's not really what people think of for classic, even the Phil era, that much. Because it was the last one I bought, actually. Anyway, so then later in 78, I think it was later in 78, they released, and then there were 3, of course, alluding to the fact Steve Hackett left and only was just Phil Collins, Mike Rutherford, and Tony Banks. So, I don't know if they ever say it in that order. They say Phil Collins, Tony Banks, and Mike Rutherford. I think it's usually Rutherford Banks versus Banks Rutherford, which is weird. But I was alluding to like Wind and Wuthering a few minutes ago. having that song Your Own Special Way. I think they kind of trumped that and wrote a better pop ballad with Follow You, Follow Me. And it was their biggest like single at the time. The other track on this was kind of a pop ballad as well, is Undertow. But the rest of this album, it's kind of spotty to me. I mean, again, I would lean toward the 70s Genesis over a lot of the 80s Genesis, but Many Too Many isn't bad. Deep in the Motherlode, The Lady Lies, Say It's Alright Joe. I haven't listened to this album in at least a couple years, maybe more than that, come to think of it. Ballad of Big, Snowbound. Burning Rope is another one. This is a 7-minute piece, which I believe is on a couple of the stuff I'm going to show in a few minutes here. So that was the epic at the end. They tended to do that with Afterglow and with, well, sort of the suite that ends in Los Endos. Did I just... Okay. So yeah, I mean, then there were 3... I don't know, I guess if I had to choose between that and Wind and Wuthering, it's tough. The fact that Wind and Wuthering has Hackett kind of supports that album's case, but it's a push. It's really a push, because I like a lot of this record. I like Undertow and Ripples especially, probably almost better than anything on Wind and Wuthering. So, anyway, I mean, I like the 11th Earl Mar, but I don't know, you're splitting hairs. You're kind of looking at mid-tier Genesis albums, so alright. I can do this in the right order, yeah. So I'm going to just do the studio stuff first. So I have 2 copies of their next record, Duke, which this is a promotional copy. I don't know where. And then I got this copy right here, so I have 2. And this was a British pressing. And it's even like the covers, the material, unless this is due to like oxidizing or something, it's a little different material on this one. And I really enjoy this, and I've kind of concluded that this is the best Phil Collins Genesis record, Phil Collins-led Genesis record. I absolutely adore the last couple tracks, Duke's Travels and Duke's End. Absolute, total goosebumps. I love the drum parts. Phil's drum work on this record is among the best. I would put it alongside, like in that closing section with the Cinema Show and the Musical Box, the best drum work he's ever done. But then the opening part of that suite, Behind the Lines, Duchess, and then Guide Vocal, are also great. Plus, you got Man of Our Times, which is a great sort of epic pop soaring ballad. Misunderstanding, which has like a very 50s, late 50s pop, power pop, old time rock and roll aesthetic. I always think of like the Diner. It sounds like the Beach Boys. I know Downfall did a Genesis retrospective video, very cool. I'd recommend anyone check it out. Recently, and he mentioned he'd compare it to Fool in the Rain from Led Zeppelin, which I can sort of see, but I still think Misunderstandings just kind of got a dun dun dun. It's just got, especially with the whole vocal woo, that kind of thing. It's just, you want to go to the drive-in movie get the malt and the burger and the fries with your sweetheart. It just sounds. I always think of that. I mean, and it's kind of funny because that song is one of the only songs my fiance likes. From Genesis in general, but actually from even this period of Genesis. Heath Hayes, honestly, I need to remember that. I don't know if that's like an interlude. Turn It On Again, of course, was kind of a hit too, and they've done it live. Really was always a staple live, actually. And these other ones, Cul-de-sac, Alone Tonight, Please Don't Ask. I mean, this isn't a perfect record. I don't rate this at like 5 stars. But it flows really well. The production, even though it sounds 80s, came out really early in 1980. So it was even has a little character, a little different side to their artwork, the cover art, but it's like an animated, it's like a, what's it, Dilbert? Almost reminds me of like pre-Dilbert, like proto-Dilbert, the style of drawing. And actually Caddisfly, the band I love, used artwork that's a little bit like that. And actually they are Genesis fans, especially the 80s Genesis, so that kind of makes some sense. So anyway, I'm going to show quickly. I showed these at one point in a just a vinyl video, but I got these last summer in Cleveland about a year ago. This is from, let's see, it's a 2 LP set from Drury Lane, London, May 4th, 1980, and it has, here's the set list. I'll hold this for just a few seconds if people can see it, hopefully. A lot of Peter stuff, and I'm going to have to pause.